Good morning, everybody in child literacy. I'm going to be talking about three different books today. The first one we're going to start with is called Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. And we're going to start off with it was written by Robert C. O'Brien, and it was published in 1971. It's a fun book. I read it with my sister when I was younger, and it's about a family of mice that go to a group of rats that have been genetically altered by an organization called NIMH. The theme of this book would definitely be the hill with a climax, because she keeps going through all these tasks and going to all these people, and finally her goal to save her child is completed and accomplished, and she saves her family and everything, and it all works out for the best. We're now going to hear from my roommates who actually had read this book. So, ladies, we're talking about the rats, Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. And what do you guys remember about the book, and what did you think about the book?
I remember really liking it as a kid. I think the idea of intelligent rats was kind of cool, like animals that could talk and could use electricity and medicine and things like that, and that they were building this whole empire under the field that the farmer didn't know about. It was fascinating.
I remember being really kind of mad at the fact that the scientists had done this to the rats. It was like they had stepped outside of our moral and ethical boundaries in order to create something that they thought would just be cool because they wanted to, and so that kind of ruined how these rats were. It wasn't very...
It was kind of pro-animal rights.
Yeah, it was. Pro-animal rights, that's what would say it would be.
Mm-hmm. Now, would you recommend this for young readers, or would you prefer they were older, or what would you think about giving this book to a child?
I liked it as a kid. It was one of my favorite books. We had a movie of it that I loved watching. I still watch it with my siblings sometimes.
I would let a little kid read it, but then I would have to talk to them about it afterwards to make sure that they understood what it was really about, to make sure that they didn't just read it because it was a fun book, but also to learn something from it, because I believe that it has something that can be taught to young and old people.
Okay, thank you, ladies. Okay, so our next book is called The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins. It's written by Dr. Seuss. It was one of my favorite children's books, picture books, when I was little, and my dad always read it to us. It's a story about a little boy who, when in the presence of the king, can't take his hat off because every time he does, another one is still on his head. And it goes through this process of the king trying to make him do it, and then the king sends him to the executioner, but the executioner won't kill him because his hat won't come off, and that was a kind of a faux pas, was to kill somebody with their hat on. And then the nephew convinces the king's nephew, that is, convinces the king to take and push Bartholomew off the highest tower. And while they're climbing up to this tower, Bartholomew is taking hat after hat off his head, and they keep getting more fancy, more grand, more beautiful. By the time they get to the top, he has this beautiful hat with tons of feathers, and it's jeweled and everything. It's gorgeous. Well, the nephew is very jealous of this fact because the king is like awed by this hat and really likes it and wants it. And so the nephew tries to still push Bartholomew off because he's jealous. But the king stops him, and in this book he actually gives him a spanking. And then the king buys the hat from Bartholomew and sends Bartholomew home with a huge sack of money, which is good because Bartholomew's family was kind of poor. They lived out in the country and they didn't have much. This book is definitely the hero theme of Bartholomew trying and trying to get his hat off and finally accomplishing it. And he goes through 500 hats to do it, but he finally gets it off. And so That would be the theme, and I really liked this book when I was little because it was mainly in black and white, but there were splotches of red, like the hats were all red, and I believe the king's coat was red, and so it was a lot of fun to look at the contrast and that little pop of color and those dark lines and everything. It's a fun book to just read with your kids, to have a good laugh with them and everything, and that's that one. Next we have The Wind in the Willows, and it was written by Kenneth Grahame, and it was first published in 1908. I read this book with my dad. He would read it to us as a bedtime story, and I loved it. It is a chapter book, and so every night we'd get a new chapter for our bedtime story. And my dad would do different voices for the different characters, which is probably the reason I loved it so much when I was little. The theme in this is definitely circular because it always goes back to them being on the riverbank. And it's just a lot of fun. I loved the differences between the characters and everything because you had Rat, who is very smart and sensible, and then you had Molly, who is just a really good friend and very sweet. You had Mr. Badger, who was somewhat grumpy, but definitely wise about how things needed to be done, and was very smart with money and how things were supposed to go, and a very strong moral code. And then you had Toad, who was just kind of a little bit of a flake. He would just go and do whatever he wanted. He didn't care how much it inconvenienced everybody else, which was kind of sad. And then the whole story, they're trying to help Mr. Toad, break this habit of just being reckless and everything. And it ends up with them finally getting him to change. And it's just a really fun story. It's also made into a movie. There are two different versions. There's the Disney version that's really cartoony, and then there's another version that's not so cartoony, but it's still really good, and it tends to follow the book more. And so it's a good beginner chapter book. I would use it for a child that is in the process of switching from doing just picture books to going to chapter books, because it's really simple. It's not got a lot of hard words to pronounce or anything, but it's still fun and engaging and really interesting. And so those are my critiques.